Hello, and welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today, we have the great pleasure of speaking with Nina Terrey. Nina is an experienced leader in social innovation. She's a global leader in academics and application and design thinking and integrated design approaches to address complex issues. She has a history of achievement delivering projects with change leaders, policymakers, and innovators around the globe focused on sustainable development goals. Nina holds a PhD in Management by Design and holds several Adjunct Associate professor roles with leading Australian academic institutions. In 2022, Nina was a visiting scholar at Parsons School of Design Strategies. She's a sought-after public speaker on design, gender equity, and sustainable impact, as well as the author of Design for a Better Future, a guide to designing in complex systems. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. Today, I have the absolute pleasure of speaking with Nina Terrey. I've been looking forward to this episode so much. So I'm so glad she's here. She's global partner at Thinkplace. Nina, welcome.
Thank you so much, Pana. It's great to be here.
Great to have you. Please tell us a bit more about yourself and your background for our audience as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Look, I'm one of the co-founders of a company called Thinkplace Global. We're an international strategic design and innovation company. We've been around since 2006, originally from Australia, which you probably can tell from my accent. And really, we've seen, I guess, the genesis, the beginnings of design thinking, and really seen that evolve over time to where it is today. My role in the company has really evolved over that time. So I've had a variety of roles, apart from the business management and the evolution as a company, but looking at the methodologies of design, really seeing where design has shifted to play active roles around addressing inequities in society. And in particular, in the last handful of years, really driving a strong emphasis around sustainability, originally framed strongly around, and still is, around the UN SDGs, but also now really looking at concepts around regenerative design. So I'm leading up a new group that's really driving, I guess, some new ideas and methods to really focus on how we can actually collaborate where we need to really get the futures that we need, that are bigger than just climate, but integrated solutions around the environment and our people and overall humanity. So I'm really excited about this part, because I think where design is going is the literacy is getting much richer. It's getting much more integrative with very different discourses than we've seen in the past. And so therefore, I want to sort of touch on that a bit today. But other parts about me is I also have a PhD in design. I do teach as well outside of the practice of design. And as Panard knows, I've recently completed a visiting scholar position with Parsons School of Design in New York, where it was a great opportunity to bring to the table with new future leaders in design, how we're applying strategic design, and also really seeing the application and the demands that are in the marketplace. That's a bit about me.
That was brilliant, and I can already tell, as someone who is teaching at Parsons School of Design, that you already made your mark in the year that you were in, and created brilliant content for the studio that I'm leading today. So there are a few things I want to just reflect on and highlight from just your introduction. Really, you said since 2006, and I'm even looking at the landscape of where design is today and things that need to be done around design and how we approach design. And 2006 must be you're the avant-garde. You were the first ones to really talk about it. And I'm curious to hear kind of your reflection on, as you were advocating for a certain approach on how we should be designing, right? How does it differ today versus then? How what do you find that is changing the way you're trying to educate clients, partners, but also advocate for the right way to do so? And then from that, I would love for you to zoom into regenerative design a bit more, and what was kind of the path that led you to that today, and really seeing the need of how that's how we need to be designing today. So a little bit of both, if that's okay.
Yeah, that'd be perfect. I've already put some thoughts to that, because I do think, having been at very early stages of this idea of design being applied in contexts that it typically hadn't it's a real honor to be, I guess, part of that evolution and seeing the growth of both the discipline and I guess the services and marketplace as well. But before we start, I think what's really important is that we do understand what we mean by strategic design, and I wanted to use that term and see how that's evolved. It's more in the applications, but also the different, I guess, knowledge bases and skills that have become part of that. But ultimately, strategic design, we're talking about creating very meaningful, empathetic and impactful experiences that resonate with users and communities on a very deep emotional level, and really making sure that that is done in a way that delivers on measurable results that align with whatever the kind of focus is, whether it's an organization's focus and goals or a public policy or an impact program. And I think part of that definition is what we're seeing is a real evolution of where is the point of focus for strategic design. So whilst we have concepts such as human-centered, I think there's a lot more that's moving into more kind of integrated human and planetary centered. So for me, a lot of this is moving towards that, trajectory around regenerative design. But I'm just going to give you maybe 3 broad themes, certainly from our practice in terms of what we've seen since that time, around 2006. It's important to realize that I think every designer has a DNA. So where did you originally, I guess, learn about design? Where did you apply it? What sort of challenges? And so for myself personally in our company, it was really in public policy. So really designing for public good. And so that was really before, the invention of SDGs. And it was really about focusing on where public policy and service can really be innovated. And it's a really rich and rewarding territory to design. We've seen incredible results in the redesign of policy for children in out-of-home care systems. I've done a lot of work around reducing domestic violence, and even, working with very, strongly engineered and structured sectors like energy sectors, seeing those things evolve by doing strategic design. And it continues to remain a very strong field of application, but it's certainly where our sort of DNA is. What it means is that we kind of think about designing as a big system of change. But in terms of influencing that, and we really found influence was originally in the public sector because they're kind of part of that doing things for public good. So that was really where we played originally. A next kind of theme that evolved for us is seeing where there are these other landscapes where we need to empower people, particularly people who aren't typically involved in ways to make change happen and they are most impacted. So we saw a lot and continue to see a lot of work in development programs like funded by aid organisations, philanthropic organisations, NGOs, where you're really looking at focusing on developing and emerging economies and applying strategic design, but particularly with behavioural science as well. So we've done several or many interventions over the years that are focused on sorts of projects like uptake of maternal health care, accelerating the elimination of certain types of public health diseases, like trachoma was one where it was looking at behavioural ways in which people are washing and just looking after themselves. And that is a really important area to empower people in their own ways of managing their health and lifestyle. We've done extensive work looking at malnutrition, and so moving into product innovation as well as the system innovation. So I think that is really quite exciting and interesting, and that continues to work as well. The third area really has been to moving into this broader sustainability kind of area. So certainly the SDGs have framed that, but in particular, it's actually about looking at more industry and sector-wide imperatives to move to net zero, or looking at nature regeneration, but also equity and inclusion. And different sectors will have different, areas where they need to focus. So we've been thinking more and more about regenerative design, and it's particularly got my attention because I think the genesis of sustainability is part of the language. It's in there, but there's been probably some predominant worldviews about what that means, and that's predominantly been institutionally focused, and really looking at how organizations can play a role, where regenerative is really starting to expand on that and have much stronger relationship to nature. So you asked about what does that mean. So for me, it's about really embracing even more of a holistic approach and really bringing in that whole systems thinking and really looking at resilience and equity in systems. And there's this really nice kind of narrative to design, which is the needs of society and the integrity of nature. And our needs of society relate back to our economies and our organizations, what they're making, how they're making it and providing it. And so you're really trying to create these systems that are trying to enhance the natural environment, but also build this resilience into ourselves as people and what we're doing. And so it's a very big and ambitious area, but it's a really rich area, I think, for strategic design to start to play at a really different level of influence, I think, and also language and literacy to that point.
Yeah, and I love, I mean, the fact that you also, I feel like, started in like the public space kind of built the foundation for that, because you were already having a much broader systems view into this like
Yeah.
approach. And I think it's so, I mean, so necessary and accurate in the way that too, like we definitely have seen, as in many creative fields happens, right? A lot of things, concepts that are being implemented can be used towards the sake of like capitalism in a way where human centricity definitely has been interpreted a lot around like customer centricity, right? Like how do we make it more smooth or more seamless so it's purchased and consumed. So there has been definitely a lot of like brain power towards that too. But then we're kind of like forgetting that what we are doing not only needs to sustain for people, but also planet for it to really sustain, right? So in that sense, like bringing in all stakeholders, including nature, into the process and seeing how we might do that. That that is really like how we should be approaching strategic design. And I feel like that has been a little bit secondary up until like recently too, like where maybe ESGs also enforce SDGs to make them a bit more like actionable, where we're seeing definitely a lot more convergence in concepts around social equity and justice and sustainability. Whereas like I feel like you guys have been doing it since like 2006, but I feel like now we're seeing more and more understanding and the need towards that, as maybe we're also reaching these 2030, 2050 goals that many corporations and institutions have been laying out. And I also want to highlight kind of what you were talking about in terms of uh, product innovation and how that calls for the systems design, because what we're also seeing is that we, as design solutions, we could be coming up with certain processes, products, systems, mechanisms that could address the problem. Meanwhile, trying to also operate in a system or a process that is quite outdated, right? So therefore, we see sometimes solutions failing, not because of the solution itself, but maybe in the context that it's trying to operate. So I love that you mentioned that the need to kind of address the system that it's going to operate in as well. And I feel like there's a lot more almost process innovation work that needs to happen before the product innovation for the product to also sustain whatever those products or outcomes are. And that is not getting enough spotlight. I like, and we were recently, I was at a conference in Calgary yesterday, and that even like came, we were talking about quality in built environments, and it even came up there. Like we're very big on outcomes, case studies, like that final snapshot with a beautiful picture, but the spotlight is not necessarily much on the process. Like there is not much glory there, and we need to put more spotlight on how we need to innovate the process. So I love that you mentioned product innovation within the system itself, and I would love your reflection on that too, like how you're
Yeah.
seeing, are you seeing this also, and how you think we might address that as well?
Yeah, look, very much so. And I'm glad you've raised it, Pinar, because it does bring to mind one project, which our reports are publicly available, so I can talk about this project. And it was a product innovation project funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation around women's menstrual health. And it was focused on a particular country, Nigeria. And we're talking, tens of millions of women who may never be able to afford, a formal solution around her menstrual health.
Wow.
Now, what was very interesting is that the project was framed initially, and it was to be open with an open mind, but it was framed around accessibility and affordability. So if you think about product, the thing itself, right? What can we do to make those two variables kind of like more, affordable and accessible to women? And what was very important around that is actually to say, could we take a step back and take a systems view? Because when we actually looked around the table and we asked who's at the table to do this project, there was men and women, maybe a few more men than women, but there also were no Nigerian women at the table. So it's really important to emphasize we've got to understand what it means to be a Nigerian woman and in very diverse and different parts of Nigeria to really understand and empathize what's the innovation required here. And what actually happened, it was fantastic that we were given the permission and the scope. So it's really important to have that authorizing environment, the right sponsors for projects as well. where we really took a very social, ecological framework to actually explore and understand what's the world like for her. And we did some really great innovative research methods for that. It happened during the pandemic. So it was a really great, I say great, but opportunity to innovate how we do our design research part of strategic design. But we ended up using WhatsApp and having a conversation with women, almost 100 women over Nigeria, in her back pocket, to understand what's life like for her. How does she manage her menstrual cycle every month? And what we were able to do was actually uncover through our own inquiry, but also then through the synthesis of what came back, was a very complex environment that she lives, works, and plays, and how well she navigates that. And what became apparent is that what we were designing for was way more, as we often know, than the product itself. And what we elevated were very significant environmental issues, such as there's no waste management system, access to water was quite rare, even just the ability to go somewhere safe and private at different times of the month, or even in a schooling system where there is one bathroom, not many. There was all these environmental factors we were able to uncover. And what it meant is that our innovation process in that project really extended to much broader ideas than just how can we look at the accessibility and affordability of a particular made product. But equally in that project, what came as a result of that broader exploration was a stronger emphasis on the environment and sustainability. Not that it wasn't on the table, but I think it really centered that. And that was very pleasing, I think, when you're looking at our job as designers, is we should be improving and doing very good, not just good enough, but really good for the environment and for people. So I think that project really emphasized that product design really is more system design. And if we start with that at our inquiry level, we're more likely to get that expansive thinking. Now, there is always the challenge of, well, where are we going to act and where are we going to put a project and funds? There's always that challenge. But if you do the good research, you open up the opportunities and others can come to the table to embrace some of those. And that's exactly what happened. So behavior change projects came out of that, but also product innovation. And so it was a really, really good example to your question, which is product design has to be about systems design as well.
I love hearing that, because I feel like, and it depends maybe on the design background that we have, right? Like if we studied industrial design, architecture, service design, maybe a bit more open in service design, but in some practices, like if we have a brief, we run with like, how can we create like the best design outcome out of the brief, right? But it is so important to your point, like take a step back and kind of see, wait, 1 second, okay, where is this going to be used? How is it going to be used? Should it even be used, right? Like really just like questioning. And I do recognize we may not always have the right, again, to your point, the sponsor or the client. Some clients may not want to hear it, right? Right. And they really believe it's the case. But I feel like it kind of touches upon what is our responsibility as designers, right? And I think, and I would love to get your like thoughts on this. Of course, to your point, timelines and budgets are always restrictions, but they have always been the restrictions too. They are always the constraints that we operate within. And I feel like sometimes that could be used as an excuse to not take responsibility on something, right? Oh, but my scope and budget is for this, so I'm doing this. But I also feel like, especially in the world we live in today, we no longer have the luxury to not have the responsibility to challenge the brief, or even taking a bit more responsibility than design and maybe advocating for certain processes to take place, or maybe even volunteering for and that's kind of like what we do sometimes for the prototyping piece, to ensure to be able to show it's viable, right? Like we could actually do this, and we're not necessarily relying on maybe existing like supply chains and vendor relationships, but we really want to show that it's possible. So I feel, and this is a debate sometimes I have with like other designers where they're like, but it's not my responsibility. And I'm like, yeah, but can we afford not to have it as a responsibility? So I would love to get your like thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting territory. And I think, well, two things I want to say. One is, for every limit, it presents as a constraint. And that, as far as I'm concerned, is an opportunity for innovation. Because true innovation comes from actually more constraints than less. And therefore, we have to actually kind of flip that frame to say, great, so if the budget is only this, the time is only that, what can we actually do? I think when it comes to the design activities within certain budgets, you have to get really innovative to do well, to do a good enough job if the budget, like literally you're given a certain amount of money, right, to run a project. And that is where you do have to think innovatively about more efficient means of data collection if it's at the research front end. Different ways of capacity building when it comes to doing testing of prototypes. So we've done some incredible projects that have meant, particularly again through the pandemic, we couldn't travel. So it meant we had to really innovate around capacity building, people on the ground, local people, enrolling the non-designer to actually participate and actually enact and complete certain activities that the designer would typically do. So I think what it means that as strategic designers, we have to constantly say, well, how can we do the tasks we need to do in whatever constraints we actually have? Because what can come of that are some really positive unintended consequences. So for example, capacity building, non-designers on the ground opens up whole other opportunities for people. And, you know, I've seen even just unintended kind of consequences of participants seeing that they could perhaps take a career in design. So something completely unintended, going from participant to a potential actor, you know. So I really find that quite exciting. The other point about, the second point about challenging the brief, it's not uncommon, for example, I've got a proposal on the table at the moment. It's saying this is what we think the problem is, this is what we think the solution is, but they're still asking you to do a phase of research. So the way that you approach that is you absolutely acknowledge this is the way you've scoped, or you've defined the problem, this is where you've scoped what you think maybe the answer is, but it's in the stage of doing the research, and that's not just at one point. We know that becomes iterative, particularly if it's a more agile approach that you take, and I would encourage that to form any designer's toolkit, and certainly project design. But it's an opportunity to actually, in that research, to uncover what matters to the outcome that people are after. So if the outcome is we want to shift behaviors, we want to see a reduction in something occurring in a society or a community, that's the goal. Your role as a strategic designer is to find out how many levers can we pull to get that goal. So even if the client might want one lever, we want a new website or something that you think that's not going to be the answer, you need to start where they're at and then demonstrate through evidence and empathy and get others to tell the story, not yourself as a designer. I think that is where we've got huge value, I think, is that we're illuminating other people's needs and helping them get their case forward. And I've seen this happen in really highly sensitive contexts. I was involved in a significant review around mental health in one of our jurisdictions in Australia, and really empowering people who themselves have challenges in the communication in the normal service system, but really getting their voices heard by decision makers really made a difference on where you need to make changes versus where we think we need to make changes.
Yeah, and I think that's beautiful, and I think how like design profession also varies, right? Like the attitudes that we need to adopt as designers, like valuing that evidence base, and really like doing the research first before like acting on our gut reaction to something, which we may be wrong too. And then it also, that often gets associated with, and when I go into like different environments, and I come from like an engineering background, and that my role over life evolved into more business and design strategy. But I would see this like kind of like prejudice against like designers too. Oh, the designer ego. Like in architecture, we even have more of that. So like that initial reaction of like, but you may not need that, is associated with kind of like that bias maybe that is being like built throughout the years. And the more we value research and focus on like building evidence, even if like our initial gut was towards something, I think that is also kind of like breaking that initial defensiveness or reaction that might come from a sponsor or a client. Because and it also maybe come from like pure excitement of like the project, right? But what if we do this? But I think to your point, again, like the importance of highlighting the strategy in the design process, strategically bringing it up at times that is important and has the right stakeholders in the room to kind of really advocate for the right process. And I love how you highlighted how constraints create like opportunities, because in the end, we need to move more towards a process where we give equal weight and importance to both professional experience, but also lived experiences.
Yeah.
And if anything, having an elastic team structure and expanding our team to include people with the lived experiences into the process makes it richer. And I feel like it also gives us the agility to deal with the timelines, like they're already on the ground, right? And maybe it doesn't necessarily turn into like a annual salary we need to pay as like a company, but we really compensate people at hourly rates, but in respectful rates too. And I think it's shocking to me sometimes when I like talk to people in like procurement positions and like high level, saying like, oh yeah, like, you know, when we recruit people from like community, they're compensated at a rate as the, you know, a strategist might be, or a consultant might be paid at an hourly rate. And they're like, oh, interesting. They're like, is it though? Like, technically, they're like advising you, right, with their lived experience. So I think like what you highlighted also like shows that opportunity for us to really expand what team is, right? And how we can actually like co-design and move more towards that. And I love the example you gave, like how you basically did diary studies over WhatsApp. But yeah, it's very eye-opening to us too. We always learn as well, like as we adapt.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is interesting. I think the other thing is working out your relationship with participants in any research project. So even that example with the menstrual health project, the intent started off with let's build a community of women to go on the journey with us. So it wasn't just treat people as research participants. So I think that's really important. And so what actually happened is that, you know, you invite people in and you're having a conversation, they're actually opening up their lives to you. And I think no matter what you pay for that, that's actually a privilege, right? And we've got a responsibility. If we open that dialogue up, then how do we kind of play with that dialogue, but then respect it, and also continue that dialogue where we think we can actually add value. And I think the ingenuity of the everyday can actually be leveraged a lot more. So co-creating ideas is really, really powerful. And again, it isn't about there's a technical solution there, but there certainly can be an empathetic, but there also can be some very practical and insightful ways that solutions can actually be thought of, but also just to make sure that we're just in tune to understand what matters to people. And so going back to this point around regenerative design, more and more people are articulating, well, what can I do to make a difference in terms of the environment more broadly? How do I actually deal with my own kind of immediate environment of my friends, my family, my own social system, you know, and where is my wallet choice going at the end of the day? And we're seeing massive shifts, right, in terms of generations that are making choices to choose products and solutions that are thinking about these broader factors. So even as we do our research, how are we bringing those different perspectives and literacy to the table? Because we can still be quite biased and only be thinking about a human need, but they're going to be uncovering demands and expectations that mean, do we have the literacy as strategic designers to translate that? So, for example, we're getting a lot more demands both from clients and markets, but also from consumers, which is how do I improve or reduce the costs of living, including things like, you know, energy use. And then you have the energy system saying, how do we transition to be more renewable? But we've got these challenges of demand, supply, and all these sort of technical things. So how do we as designers work with people who understand the literacy of an energy system, but then you've actually got the consumer every day? So we're seeing increasingly just this integration then of looking at, you know, sustainable behavioral aspects, looking at what do we mean by the technical aspects of changing the energy use and kilowatts, and does that even make any sense to the everyday person? So whereas designers need to build some of this bridging literacy to some of these broader kind of like changes that are needed, and it's not just a simplistic view of these are my needs and wants. We have to start to build a connection and a bridge. And we're seeing some really, really exciting and important projects where strategic design is starting to really work with, I guess, you know, energy experts, but actually they don't know anything about design and innovation and what it means to understand people and how they behave and what matters. So these integrating aspects, I think, are the way of the future for strategic designers. So we need to know business language. We need to understand, you know, different environments and different kind of like frameworks that people use as well. And that's something that I'm finding quite exciting. I think important. It's really important work that we need to be playing in.
I love that. And it's kind of it kind of helps us to, again, maybe take a step back in all these like problems we're trying to like tackle, and in the end recognizing that no matter whatever the problem is we're addressing, these are all quite human challenges, right? There's going to be communication involved, there's going to be adoption of a new tool or a process or um, mechanism in the company. There's going to be implementation of this work. There's going to be adaptation, maybe like based on the context. There's going to be scale issues. So like there's so many things that are just very human. And even even if AI is there to help us, collaboration with AI is quite human. So in that sense, it's very interesting to think about like our role as like strategic designers and how like what are we really trying to solve for, right? Like if we have a problem that is presented to us in the energy sector, in the end, is it going to be about how we communicate this overall? Like how do we create inclusive dialogues around this, right? So I think that systems view really helps us to take that more zoomed in approach better, even to kind of like take that step back and see like what human behavior are we dealing with here, right? And this is regardless of whatever field we're in. And I think this is something to something important to highlight also, because sometimes we get maybe frustrated or even paralyzed about like the scale of the problem, right? But in the end, the process and what we need to focus on and what we need to look out for seems to be scalable in its own way, right? Like we're all humans. We're going to deal with something human here. What is that we're tackling? And in that sense, I wonder if if this was more a common dialogue among all designers, all design professions, could that change? Could that move us all towards regenerative design a bit more? Going back to what you were saying, like based on our design foundations, how we operate tends to differ a little bit. But if we just like zoom out a little bit and say like, okay, we're going to be dealing with this human aspect of things like behavior, then we all find like commonalities and maybe ways of like we're implementing to be able to have brought bigger progress towards having regenerative approaches.
Yeah, and I think, and building on that point, I think that's really important, all the things that you're raising there about where we play, how we see our role, and we still are fundamentally, it's about how we are as people. I think the bit that I'm starting to see more and more kind of interest in is how do we actually have the right level of conversation? And your point about AI earlier, there's kind of two parts to that to me, and that is it's the quality of questions that we ask. Equally, it's actually the quality of our ability to critique and see if what we are getting back is actually helpful or not. And so whilst that's a whole topic on itself, I just want to touch on that because strategic designers are very good, they should become good at the fitness of asking very good questions. So it's the quality of questions that you ask or uncover to ask and learn about and frame that actually is a huge value proposition that we actually bring to the table. And I think one of the things that I'm curiously kind of playing with, and I've just written a blog this week about the different frameworks and models around regenerative approaches. And one of them is how do we kind of take a regenerative mindset as strategic designers? And part of this is really using the core skills and competencies and methods we have at strategic design, but then building into that broader understandings of systems thinking, but also bring in different aspects that are absolutely prerequisite, which I think we embody as strategic designers, but things like adaptive mindsets, the ability to actually really kind of work with ambiguity and to really start and play and explore with the intent to resolve something. So they're really important things that we bring. But equally, I think we've got to start to build our own muscle in areas such as what do we mean by ecological health? What do we mean by social health? What do we mean by economic health on new terms? That I think as designers, we'll find ourselves in very different and enriching contexts, I think, and be invited to different tables of problems if we can start to build some of these other threads. So for me, that's becoming a really important part of being a strategic designer and still being true to what we're about, but really having this other sort of literacy, I think, can help create some bridges where I hear narratives. I was at I like going to all sorts of sort of like events just to sort of see what's happening. One of them was the Built Environment, an event here in New York, and just walking around all the different, I guess, stands and people selling all sorts of really interesting materials that I'm not an architect or a builder. But I wanted to see the word sustainability, where is it being presented? How's it been presented? How's it built into products and services? And I was listening to one geothermal company provider and a couple of different people at a stand, and what they were talking about was the inertia of people's behaviors and attitudes to doing and trying something different. And as I was sitting there listening, or standing there and listening, I thought that's exactly what strategic designers do. We actually are bridging between people of different worldviews and mindsets with equal the same challenges, but struggling over where do we act or what's the solution we need to make. So I think the dialectic ability to facilitate, really enable these bridges between these different worlds. We've got to have the literacy to be respected and we understand some of those dynamics. We don't have to know the depth, but we have to be able to at least connect those people, because that's where I think we play huge values and moving things forward.
I'm so glad you highlighted that. I think that like we already see that there's no way we could address any problem by operating in silos, right? So the fact that we play the role of being the glue in between is so important if we want to really find design solutions and outcomes. And this can be inter-department in an organization, this can be inter-industry, but really pointing out how might we like come together and how can designers kind of like operate as center of that wheel to like make that happen. I also love the analogy of like using like a conductor, right? Like, and then like once we come together, what do we do? And like, how can we kind of, and I guess like, I mean, we touched upon AI a little bit, but like the role of the conductor may be even like more and more important as AI starts to kind of bring more efficiency and things that maybe would take a lot of time for us, right? And I 100% agree with you on what you said, like asking the right questions. I'm sure you've witnessed, and many of us witnessed, like how research can be done very poorly and how we're asking some questions we never should ask. But also how we synthesize. And I would love to get your thoughts on this, because I think synthesis is like one of the biggest like strengths and power of a strategic designer. And it's a muscle that we continually need to work on to get better at it too. There's no like prescriptive way of doing synthesis. I feel like the more you do it, the more you get better, the more you connect the dots, and the more better we surface what we need to take action on. And I see also, like as an educator too, I see in the students, that's the part where the students struggle most on initially. And that may come from lack of experience or lack of exposure into like projects. But I would love to get your thoughts on how can all designers become better synthesizers in a way, as well as like any recommendations on getting better at that, because that's something that AI is never going to do too. Like right now, if we even look at like ChatGPT's case, it's like an incredible data scraper, right? Like if we really want to get like a quick view of something, and not necessarily refined or polished or accurate maybe, but like quick download on a topic. But we're not going to get insights. We're not going to get the real insights unless we go in and do it ourselves, right? So that we're going to hold that responsibility. And how can we get better at that? I would love to ask you that.
Yes, and that is I loved your point about it is an ongoing activity of fitness, as far as I'm concerned. You don't just become good at something, you have to be constantly practicing. So I think a couple of things for me. One is I made a personal choice to do, originally it was a master's by research, and that actually evolved into a PhD. So I knew I needed to build my research skill. So I think as a designer, you have to recognize where you need to do some skill development, and nothing teaches you more than having to do some sort of, whether it's a short or a bigger task like a PhD, to actually learn the skills of doing research and the synthesis and the writing that goes with it. But ultimately, what people need to be thinking about in terms of strategic designers is actually doing the reading of final products of research. So if you read some final products, you need to look at the language, the articulation, the specificity that is given to how you frame an insight, how you look at how the evidence was narrated and pulled together. And if you can go back and understand the source data, like the methods they used, how they collected it, the questions that they asked, then you can start to get a little bit of a picture of, wow, okay, that was a pretty impressive like research protocol. It was really rich the way they did that, or how they let participants kind of tell them what to do, or they involve the participants in the synthesis, whatever the approach was. So I think it's about look at what's been done elsewhere. I certainly got a lot about how to articulate and express well-crafted insight by just reading other people's work, whether that's an academic expression of it or more of a commercial product setting, you know, but seeing how it's done well is always very helpful, I find. Practicing is really critical, and also getting critical thinkers around you. So, you know, in our design practice, you know, I actually value someone who's not on my project, just a sticky big in, come over and just have a look over my shoulder. What can you see here? What's happening here? And I've equally done that to my colleagues' work. And that's where we find there's some really great, you know, accidental but also helpful insights, like, well, what about this, or what's not being said here? So sometimes your research and the ways to generate ideas is not from what is there, but what is not there. But going back to your original question about the synthesis point, I think the thing is you need to be comfortable with kind of working the data, expressing it, extracting it. Is this meaningful? Is it helpful? But go back to what you're doing it for, or why you're doing it. So what's the intent behind this? You can find out a lot of stuff, and people tell me all sorts of things, but why is that relevant to this project or this problem? Or is it making us think differently about the original inception of the project or the problem? But ultimately, I mean, I've seen a lot more work done because I think, again, because of the pandemic, it's online. We're using a lot of digital whiteboards, which is great. Yeah. Personally, for me, I still love to get down and dirty physically. So I'm quite happy to be in a hybrid world, but ultimately really getting physical, pulling things apart, moving things around on a table, seeing patterns, taking photos, or snips or screens, whatever, that we can start to see from where things emerge. You have to be playful, and you have to say, is there something interesting? And a test for me about synthesis is, have we uncovered something we did not know before we started? And if it's still telling you the same stuff, you have to dig deeper. You have to kind of keep working that information. And also, again, checking in with other people, trying to build some other points of view. But for me, it has to be a passion to want to understand more. And then I think that should drive the quality of your synthesis over time. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. No, this is great. And I love that we're talking about like how to do research and how to approach synthesis, only because like the more, you know, fast-paced we're getting, the more the world's becoming volatile, the more technology we're integrating into the process. I think it's going to matter even more so, right? Like, what are we feeding into these systems or technologies is becoming really, really important. And also, what are we highlighting? How are we defining the focus areas? And are we going about it right? And that's going to call for a real good practice of like too. So I'm so glad we touched upon those in order to be able to do better regenerative design too, right? So like the really building the foundation strong. And to quickly also like capture your thoughts on, so where do you see today, and maybe in the next 10, 20 years, we're going to see more like strategic designers working on areas? And we talked about obviously like nature is a big piece to it, just because where we are at today with like climate change, and what areas of opportunity you see that are, I guess, strength and brain power is very needed, and we will be working on a lot.
Yeah, well, I think these are sort of those golden questions, aren't they? I think for me, the course of strategic design is much more of a emphasis of an integrated approach. So this ability to kind of stand at the intersection of looking at how do we evolve our economic kind of models, how do we actually evolve our ecological and also our social kind of models of how we operate. And I think really lifting and really playing it at those intersections, I think we'll see strategic designers actually really contribute a lot to all parts of a business model for all intents and purposes. Or if you're working in like a public policy setting or a more kind of broader program setting, you're actually able to really kind of bring together very different kind of, intents and purposes and drivers, because something that is needed is this ability to kind of like imagine the impossible. That is always going to be required. No matter what AI can do, there will be stuff that it can absolutely take us to a whole new level. And I think we're all observing, experiencing it. It's becoming almost the layperson can experience AI now for the first time, really. And I think that's making everyone go, whoa, what is this actually going to mean? So I think as designers over the next 10, 20 years, we've got to be open to be exploring, playing with new tools, questioning and actually saying, well, where is our value now? Where do we see our role? And when you think about it, to your point about things being scraped or things being assembled, or maybe things being potentially kind of projected, where are the spaces where things haven't existed yet? That's where we've got to find ourselves playing, where ingenuity, creativity, the power of being human will always need to be tapped into. And I think the way that we wrestle our relationship with data and information that has been somehow kind of artificially kind of constructed, we need to be sort of working out that pattern as we go forward. But I certainly think designers really need to lift their literacy that is going to get them into these different conversations, whether you're going deep and working hard within a sector. Like you might be going, I'm going to be a strategic designer in the agriculture sector because we're moving to regenerative systems, food systems. So all of a sudden you're going to become a specialist deep in that system because there's a whole lot of things. There are people, there are networks, there's pilots, there's projects trying to scale things. And I think strategic designers will find that a satisfying career trajectory rather than just kind of be sitting in, and I say this respectfully, than just a brand only, but potentially looking at systems of brands and systems of business models. It could be my bias because that's where my brain goes, is kind of thinking about the big.
Great bias.
But I think if we think about those kind of complex systems, it could be the fashion system. So you're not just a fashion designer, you are thinking about how the whole thing can be much more resilient and sustainable and good for people. So I think strategic designers have a really fascinating opportunity, and they could go down a path of a sector or a particular kind of system, and really start to build some, substantial knowledge, as well as really apply just that design thinking skill in a very strategic way.
I mean, I love that so much also because it just expands what we were earlier talking about, like the responsibility we have, right? So if we just look at like we're gaining expertise in the system and the industry itself and how it operates, and think of like ways of designing within that rather than just like I'm designing this product. It already expands our scope, but also helps us to become, to your earlier point, on more adaptive, resilient. Also using our critical thinking to like assess who else do we need at the table, who do I reach out to, who can I connect. So in that sense, I mean, that was like probably the best advice any designer can get, but any additional advice would you like to give while we're wrapping up our conversation?
Oh, look, the advice I give myself, but also give other people, and I think it's something worth having at all stages of your career as a strategic designer, and that is, are you being an adaptive designer? And I shamelessly reference this from a book called The Design Way. I really like this text by Stoltenman, and it talks about the degree to which you have an ongoing need to ask questions and to put yourself in frustrating contexts where you have no idea how to do it. And the other part is to continually build requisite routine skills that you can do very well, but not staying still on one set of skills. So you don't just do great digital design, you don't just do great kind of like service design or whatever the kind of framing of your skill set is, but you are constantly putting yourself into new kind of contexts of learning with others, different types of development, mentoring, all the different models and ways in which we learn, but sort of thinking about those two axes and then sort of being in that sort of space of constantly adapting as a designer is really important. And those people that I admire that have really rich, long careers have stayed true to things that matter to them in terms of why I do design, why it's important, but their application and where they've gone into those places, they've constantly looked to evolve and innovate. And I'll just quote one of my colleagues, Juanita. She is super critical about every project she does, but what it means is her design practice, and she does a lot of work in the developing environment, looking at behavior change, is just really something to be admired, because she's constantly saying, how can we do that better? What are some different techniques or methods we could be using or evolving? And I think that to me is what it means as a strategic designer. So that's my advice to everyone who's listening.
I love that. Continually redesign ourselves a little, but also getting out of our comfort zone. I love that. Well, thank you so much. This was such a treat. I can talk to you all day, but I
Yeah.
won't to be respectful of your time. And I look very much forward to following Thinkplace's work as well.
Yes.
There's incredible projects you guys are working on, and I encourage our audience to do so as well. And thank you.
Thank you, Penna. It's been fantastic.
And that is this week's episode of What's Wrong with the Podcast. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Links can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.